formatting is that I would talk for 20 minutes and then leave 10 minutes open for questions. But I do find that sometimes if people wait until the end of like me blah blah blahing, that they may forget their questions or they may not want to ask the question for whatever reason. So if anything comes to anyone as I'm speaking, please feel free to interrupt me. Um, I'm sure we're all getting really used to Zoom and everyone is comfortable with the idea that no one wants to just talk at a screen for a significant chunk of time. So I welcome interruptions. Please do interrupt me. Um, so, so as Mackenzie said, my name is Elizabeth Well. I'm the legal director at Ohio Crime Victim Justice Center. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we're a nonprofit here in Ohio. We actually have 3 offices around the state, one in Columbus, which is our main office, or at least it was before COVID. And then we have one in Cleveland and one in Cincinnati. And from those 3 offices, we provide services throughout the entire state of Ohio. So all 88 counties, we provide our services. And hopefully through the course of me describing our services and describing our role in the criminal justice process, you'll come to understand this more. But in a nutshell, what we do is we provide free legal representation to victims of crime during the criminal justice process when their rights are violated. And so I'm going to talk briefly, because to me 30 minutes is brief because I'm a lawyer, about the rights that victims have. And I'm speaking specifically to the criminal justice process. I know we have other presenters who are going to talk about services that OU provides, probably touch on Title IX. I'm going to keep my remarks specific to the criminal justice process, and I'm going to let the folks who specialize in Title IX speak to that. So we get a lot of calls from victims from around the state, and sometimes they'll contact us before they've even reported a crime. So that's how I'm going to talk about victims' rights. I'm going to talk to you all like I'm talking to a victim who's asking me about whether or not they should report a crime. Because victims will contact us and they'll say, I've heard bad things sometimes about the criminal justice process. I'm scared. I was a victim of crime and I'm trying to figure out whether I want to call law enforcement, whether I want to, tell law enforcement that I want a prosecution. I'm thinking about if a prosecution does happen, what am I going to use my voice to ask for? Because victims do have a voice in the process, and sometimes there's conflicting feelings about what the best outcome would be for a victim, especially when you have a situation like we're talking about tonight: domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault, these crimes that often are interpersonal in nature. I know, some of you may be new to college, and I know when I first went to college at OU, whoop, whoop, I believed that rape was something that happens to someone who jumps out of the shadows and grabs you. But we know that that's not true. So the crimes that we're talking about specifically tonight are all crimes that are typically perpetrated by someone that you know and probably someone that you may have a close personal relationship with. So there's all of this stuff at play for a victim when they're thinking about reporting, and we kind of have to lay out all the options for them. And luckily for me, my job is to give them all the options and let them make the decision, because I am just there to provide information and support. So let's say that we had a victim of a sex crime, and this is common for us. The vast majority of victims that we serve are victims of sex crimes, domestic violence, stalking. So very germane to our conversation tonight. They'll say to me, I was sexually assaulted over the weekend. I've had this call. What do I do? And the first step, if a victim wants to begin to engage in the criminal justice process, or even if they think they may in the future want to engage in the criminal justice process that I'll talk to them about, is going to the hospital. So if you're a victim of a sex crime or domestic violence or a serious physical assault, your first stop is often going to be the hospital. And at that first stop, you have rights. You actually have a lot of rights. More rights than I have time to go through tonight, but I'm going to give you kind of a brief rundown. So first thing, when you get to the hospital, you should be considered a priority patient. And you should have the ability to have an exam done, and then also what is called a SAFE kit, which is a sexual assault forensic exam kit. So essentially, this is where usually a SANE nurse, which is sexual assault nurse examiner, a specially trained nurse, is going to talk with you and collect evidence from your body. And that evidence could be used later on for an investigation and a prosecution. So when you see on the news all of these cold cases from around the state and country where someone went to a hospital 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 years ago and they submitted this evidence, and now we're getting a hit because the person who sexually assaulted them has done some other crime and their DNA is in a database now. That is the evidence that's collected from your body when you go to the hospital. So we always recommend that our clients, if they can, and we recommend to hospitals that they provide SANE nurses, because these nurses are specially trained, they understand trauma, they understand that they should be calling an advocate for you, which is someone who provides a completely different and crucial service when you're experiencing this trauma of having been sexually assaulted. So you should get into a room, you should get a private room, you should, be treated by someone who's familiar with trauma. You should have an advocate called for you who is going to be able to understand and provide you resources and kind of walk you through what to expect. So those are some of the things that will happen at the hospital. Certainly not all of them. One important thing that I do want to touch on, though, is when you go in for this exam and to have this evidence collected, that is at no cost to you. You won't be billed, your insurance won't be billed. That is covered by a program through our Attorney General's office. So I don't want a factor for you seeking treatment to be, is this going to be a bill that goes to me or goes to my parents? And is this going to lead to a conversation that I don't want to have right now? The caveat for that is that if you have other injuries, like you get treatment at the emergency room, that potentially could be billed to you. So it's something to certainly consider. And I know that OU has wonderful advocacy services, and they can certainly give you a lot more details when you're considering reporting on what to expect. And you can always reach out to me and the folks in my office. Because I grew up in Southeastern Ohio, I'm actually the attorney assigned to Southeastern Ohio. So you'll be talking to me and my advocate, Sierra, who is amazing. So, always feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to tap those local advocacy resources that you have when you're making these decisions. So if a victim says, yes, I think in the future I may want to have a prosecution or an investigation, I'm not sure right now, but I'd like to leave that option open to myself, so I'm going to go to the hospital. That's great. They're going to have those SANE nurse services and advocacy services. The next thing that will happen, and sometimes happens while the victim is at the hospital, is that law enforcement will respond. So if the victim says, I want to be identified, I don't want my kit to be unnamed, I'm willing to talk to a police officer, sometimes the police officer will come to the hospital while the victim is there and get an initial, usually very brief statement about what happened. Typically, this is done because they want to figure out who has sexually assaulted you, and they want to, potentially get that person if they can, or start building a case, maybe go interview that person, other witnesses, collect evidence, all of that. The law enforcement officer who responds to the hospital should be crisis intervention trained. This should be an officer who, like the advocate and like the SANE nurse, has training in working with people who are experiencing trauma. I always tell every audience when I'm training, and usually I'm training criminal justice system officials and allied professionals, our first goal should be first, do no harm. We should not create more trauma as the professionals who are providing services to victims. We should make it our goal to understand trauma and to not add to the trauma that victims are experiencing. That's critical to me in my office, everyone who works there, and all the people that you're going to talk to tonight as well. So that crisis intervention trained officer will come and talk to you as a victim, and chances are you'll probably have to go talk to that officer, maybe a detective, again later to provide more details. So when you're in the investigation stage as a victim, most of your rights that law enforcement will provide you are rights to information and rights to protection. So you have the right to know what's going on in your case. You have the right to updates in your case. Some of the things that you'll want to know, law enforcement won't be able to tell you because many things are not public record until the case is concluded. But generally speaking, you should be getting some updates, right? You shouldn't just be in the dark for months and months and then learn, oh, the prosecutor's taking your case, or oh, the prosecutor is not taking your case. So you should have some basic information there. Law enforcement also should be providing you with resources. So they have a pamphlet that's provided to them by the Attorney General's office. It's called Crime Victims' Rights in Ohio. And it essentially will walk you through all of these laws that I'm babbling about and a lot of resources that are available to you too. So above and beyond the advocacy resources that the Survivor Advocacy Program provides, or the resources that my office provides, there are so many resources that are available to you as a crime victim. The right to get, or to seek a protection order if the person, if you are in fear of the person, which if they sexually assaulted you, you probably will be. If they're stalking you, you probably will be. And the rights to seek victim compensation so that you can try to get some reimbursement from the Attorney General's office for any out-of-pocket costs that the crime has for you. So those are just some of the pieces of information that law enforcement will be providing you. And again, it's always good to have that contact with an advocate who can walk you through in more detail, how do you access these other services? What should you expect? What are the timelines? What are some of the stipulations? Things like that. And law enforcement also, per our Constitution, should be providing you protection, right? So it's reasonable protection by law. So if this person is sitting outside your house, it's reasonable for law enforcement to come by and say, what do you do? You can't sit outside this person's house. Like, we're going to arrest you for menacing by stalking if you keep hanging out here and the person has told you to leave, or trespass, something like that. So it's very circumstance dependent on what constitutes reasonable protection in each case, but that's a right that victims have during the investigation. Once you get to a prosecution, if you want to get to a prosecution, because remember, victims have choice in this, right? Like when you go to the hospital, you can do an unnamed kit. The kit's not affiliated with your name. You don't have to come forward until you're comfortable. You don't have to talk to law enforcement at the hospital. Really, in victim services, we want to emphasize that this is a choice. But let's say that you want to get to the prosecution phase and you're cooperating with law enforcement. That's something that you want to see happen because it's important to you for your healing process. At that stage, a bunch of rights open up to you. So you still have the right to know what's going on. The prosecutor needs to reinforce all of the information that you got from law enforcement about the resources that are available to you and the rights that are available to you. They need to tell you that you can request notice of hearings. If you want to get notified of every hearing in your case, you have a right to know about that. You have a right to go to the hearings. And if the hearing has anything to do with your rights, you have a right to speak directly to the judge. Now that's intimidating, and most clients that I've had in no way, shape, or form want to directly talk to the judge, like, hey, judge, I'm here and I have a little bit of something to say. It's really scary. Even for lawyers, sometimes it's scary to talk to the judge. And so you have the right to exercise those rights with an advocate, right? Because the Constitution and the Ohio Revised Code provides you the right to have a representative. So that person, from SAOP, from SAP, from any of those community organizations or any organizations affiliated with the school can help you through the criminal justice process to understand what's going on and to make sure that they're helping you advocate that your voice is heard. And that our organization can also help you with that, right? So if you go to court and the judge says, hey, you can't be here because you're a witness and we don't want you to hear everything that's happening. That's actually an outdated assumption. The law hasn't been that in Ohio for about 25 years, but some judges are a little late to the game with that. And so you want to contact an advocate or you want to contact our organization, and we can make sure that your rights are protected. You have the right to get what's called restitution in the criminal case if the defendant gets convicted, meaning if they're found guilty or if they take a plea. And that just means that the person who committed these crimes against you has to pay you back for any financial losses that you have. You have the right to give victim impact statements, to tell the court, like I said, how you're feeling. You have the right, what's called, to confer with the prosecutor, which is essentially the right to talk with the prosecutor and let them know what your positions are on things, especially things like a plea deal. If you're not super familiar with criminal justice, a plea deal is kind of like a settlement. It's where the state and the defense reach an agreement. And usually the agreement is the defendant is going to plead to something less than what we charged them with. And they're going to say that they did that. And then we're going to dismiss some of the other charges that they may have. That's something that victims often really want to have a say in, and you have a right to have a say in that. The court has to hear you out, either through yourself, through your attorney, through your advocate, and the court has to consider your position in making those decisions. You don't get to say, hey, I don't like this, we're not going to do this. These rights are designed to give victims what we call a voice, but not a veto, right? So you get to be heard, but not necessarily you're completely in control of what happens. So again, I'm going very fast, I know, because I have about 10 minutes and I do want to leave time for questions because no one has interrupted me yet. And this is kind of just a really fast, quick and dirty overview of what to expect in the criminal justice process. But just know that as these hearings are going forward, they may be talking about things that implicate your privacy. And in fact, that's something I do want to touch on because this happens a lot in sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking cases. You may be in the middle of a prosecution and the defense may say, oh, Jane Doe, we'd like to read her medical records, or we'd like to read her counseling records, or we'd like to get her cell phone so we can look through that, or get her computer so we can look through that. Or I've had cases where they wanted to get her diary. And judges will entertain that. They'll think about that. And so, if something like that is to happen, you need an attorney to come in there and address that for you. So if you do know someone, or if you're ever going through the criminal justice process yourself and they start talking about getting access to your private information, you're going to want to contact us immediately for something like that, because we'll have to turn around a defense for you really quickly on that. That's a big thing that comes up. So I wanted to flag that specifically, but also just making sure that if you want to be there, you can. If you want to be heard by the court, you can. If you want to seek that restitution to get paid back, you have a constitutional right to that. Now let's say everything has gone swimmingly for you. It's gone perfectly. You went to the hospital. You had a sane nurse. You had an advocate. They collected the evidence. It was great. A fantastic officer showed up. You gave a statement. You worked with that officer or detective through the investigation. It was great. There was a prosecution. Your rights were protected. You liked the prosecutor. It was wonderful. And ultimately, the defendant was convicted of the crimes that they committed against you. Then you get into what we call the post-conviction phase of the criminal justice process, and you have rights there too. So if they're looking at an early release, so let's say that the person gets 10 years and the defendant is saying, oh, I want to get out early, which they always do. You have a right to notice that they're asking for that, and you have a right to give a statement about that. You have a right to be present at any hearing where the judge is considering that and to make your voice heard as a part of that process. You also have that continuing right to protection. That's not just for the law enforcement phase, it's for the entire case. If that person is calling and threatening you from jail or prison, or if their family members are threatening you, hey, we want you to make a statement to let this person out. If you don't, something bad's going to happen to you or your family. You always have that right to protection. You should always be reaching out to law enforcement or the prosecutor's office and letting them know that those things are happening. So that's, in a nutshell, the criminal justice process. I know I went very quickly. I have just about 5 minutes left, I think, at this point. So does anyone have any questions And if you're letting it marinate, you can always reach out to me. Madison and Mackenzie, I think you both have my contact info. You can disperse it widely. Comfortable with that. They're like, we couldn't even formulate a question. She talks really fast.
Not so much a question, but I thought it was really interesting to know that that protection is able to continue throughout the whole process. That's something I didn't know before that I'm glad I know now.
Yeah, definitely. Our Constitution is really broad. So it says throughout the criminal justice process, victims have the right to safety and protection. And a lot of times what that looks like is kind of between the victim and law enforcement or prosecutors or, the folks at the jails or prisons. They kind of work together to fashion something that keeps that victim safe. But there are a lot of options for safety and protection. And that's actually something that we're litigating right now, kind of where we have cases on right now. We're trying to figure out how far can we stretch this? What can this look like in situations that aren't as obvious? So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll have even more law from our courts that gives even more contours to what that right can look like way beyond the time the case is over. All right. Well, I saved the 10 minutes per my instructions, but again, feel free to reach out to me. I know it's not always easy to come up with a question on the spot. Hopefully, some of what I said made sense to you. I think most people are pretty familiar who are on this call with the process, so I'm hoping it wasn't just like blah blah blah. But if it was and you need any clarification, always feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. I'm happy to speak with you. And I'll just turn it back over to you, Mackenzie.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That definitely made sense and was really interesting for sure. So now, I guess if there's no more questions, I'll hand it over to Detective Rick Sargent from OUPD.
Hi. I was going to say, how's everybody doing? But there's so many people on the call. If you feel like it, you can wave or do whatever you'd like to do. But my name is Rick Sargent. I'm a detective with Ohio University Police. I've been with OU for going on 12 years now. I have some prior law enforcement as well. Extensive experience in the private sector. And I've been a detective now over 8 years. And we deal with just about everything that could possibly happen in any other city or community happens at Ohio University in Athens. When I talk to parents and families and things like that, when they're typically on visits or at events or things like that, when I'm out and about, typically some of the questions that I'll be asked is, are there really problems here? And I tell everybody the same thing. Just like I mentioned before, that if it can happen anywhere else, it happens here to some extent. We deal with a population on a typical year of 7,000 to 8,000 people living on campus at a time, and another 20,000 people potentially in the surrounding area that are all around college age type of situation. We deal with a lot of relationship crime in, as Elizabeth mentioned, stalking, domestic violence to an extent on campus, because we don't have a lot of cohabitation situations. Our domestic violence typically ends up being people that have a connection to the university campus, or we have medical facilities on campus where we will see more of those types of crimes. We deal a lot with the stalking and menacing. That is one of, if there was a chart of the crimes that we deal with, theft is right there, that type of thing, and it's going on up. And I've got this on Zoom, so I don't know if I'm going up in this direction, or you guys can just bear with me on that. But some of the crimes that we deal with now that are trending, and they're starting to rocket off, are the telecommunications harassment and stalking and menacing by stalking. And those are a lot of the things that we deal with. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the different ones. We're going to save the sexual assault investigations for last. And I just want to kind of give you a kind of a thumbnail of what we would deal with on a daily basis. An individual that is receiving threatening texts from an ex, and will be brought in, and they'll explain, okay, well, this person is telling me this and this and this, and they're blowing up my phone. They're sending me emails. They're talking to their friends, and their friends are then sending me, nasty stuff online. They're threatening to publish photos that I've sent to them. What can we do? And basically, we sit down and we talk to them about, okay, well, what exactly do you want to do in this situation? We need to be able to gather the information, and in a situation for us to be able to move forward, we need to make sure that the individual, the victim in this case, is drawing a line in the sand, in essence, to say, I don't want any more contact from you. And once we do that, once we document that, it's typically not a situation where we get a lot of people that come up and they say, well, can't you just call them and tell them to stop? And technically, yes, but that kind of defeats the purpose of giving the person the power to make their own decisions and to take control of the situation on their own. So we'll encourage them, hey, now's the time to say, I want you to stop and take ownership of that. And that's an empowering thing we found is that by saying that, we're not taking care of their problem for them. In some ways we're in loco parentis, and sometimes they just need the nudge of, hey, you're an adult now, you need to handle something on your own. We'll take that approach, but we're also making sure that we're documenting everything. And if that person then says to, that aggressor, do not send me any more emails, texts, do not contact me in any way, I don't want to hear from you. With right there, it's like a big iron gate just slammed down. And if that other person tries to get around that gate in any way, shape, or form, then they're mine. Okay. Because then I can establish that all these different things have been, they've given them fair warning. Okay. So we can then move forward with our criminal case based on the information that we had. Now, the other stuff that we had before, the history stuff, all those nasty texts, all those, threats, any documentation or phone call or voicemails or videos. We get a lot of videos now because everyone everywhere is now videoing everything that's going on. We want to save that. We want to save those Facebook messages. They might have already been deleted off of one person's account, but they might be on another's. We can use technology to our advantage in that. We can also use some of the cool tricks that we have at Ohio University. We've got a very robust information technology. It's a monster, basically. It's everything that you need. It's all the Wi-Fi, it's all the emails and all those types of things. When you sign on and join Ohio University's network, you are allowing them to use keep your information or anything that you send, anything by, that's a contract basically. If you say, yes, I want to be able to use your Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi is basically, as you're walking through a building or on campus, it's doing the monkey bars. It's tracking through and picking onto a signal here, picking onto a signal here, picking onto a signal here. It might not seem like that's a big deal, But sometimes when it comes down to a criminal investigation, that's exactly the information that I need to catch the bad guy, because I can show that he was in a place where he says, I was never there. You can't know. I wasn't in that building. I wasn't nowhere close. And I can pull it up online and say, oh, yeah, okay, well, why was your phone connecting to the Wi-Fi in 205 Ray? Explain that. And those are the kind of things that we can use to our advantage. It's not fail safe. It doesn't always work, but it puts us in the right direction on a lot of cases. It's been very helpful to us. So I mentioned a couple different of crimes, and just to, without getting into the weeds of it, of every element of every crime and all the different variations and variables, something that is called menacing it's pretty much your garden variety, causing someone to believe that you are going to cause physical harm to them or emotional distress to them or their property or their pets or their ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend or whatever, whatever we're dealing with. That is a misdemeanor of the 4th degree. Okay. And a lot of people say, okay, well, why don't you arrest them for menacing and, put them on cuffs? I want to see them dragged off and thrown into the back of a police car. It doesn't work that way. And that can be, and that's not something that you find out until you're actually doing the job, is that in a situation like this, if someone says something and doesn't, they're not going to get arrested. They'll get a citation that they have to go and show up in court. And we're going to physically tell them, look, you got to stop what you're doing. And this is basically the line in the stand, like I was talking about earlier. You've made a point. Okay, you've got paper. I've given it to you. You have to show up in court. And that's the line of sand. If that person then goes around and then sends another text off, okay, well, and says, I'm going to get you for this, that type of thing. Well, guess what, buddy? You just compounded things. Okay. The next step up of that is menacing by stalking. And the main thing on menacing by stalking is what we call a pattern, which means obviously just one or more instance establishes a pattern. When we see the garden variety menacing by stalking that happens around in Athens and around Ohio University, menacing by stalking is pretty much right up there, because it's not just a phone call. It's not just the showing up at, or sneaking into the residence hall and pounding on somebody's door. With social media, we know that everyone's got 4, 5, 6, 7, however many Finsta, accounts you have. All those different things add up. And if someone sends you one thing on one account and one thing on another account and another, that's an easy paper trail for me to follow to establish that a pattern existed. Excuse me. Okay. So where this rolls up to a felony is if there is a prior conviction. So same individual causes you to believe that they're going to harm you or your pet or your, or your roommate, anything like that. If they've been convicted of any of one of those types of crimes, regardless of if it's you or not, if they've done this to somebody else, that becomes a felony. Okay. I'm going to pause there and see if there's anybody with any questions. Okay. So go ahead.
So if when you say it becomes a felony if there was a prior conviction, are you talking about prior conviction of menacing or menacing by stalking specifically?
No, it's a conviction of menacing.
Of
If it's
menace.
menacing by stalking, then it's any
Okay.
any type of crime that falls within that category.
Okay, thank you.
The penalties go up also if it's somebody that is in a position of like law enforcement or first responders, that type of thing, because the firefighters, EMTs, they all we're everyone that is in that kind of realm. We deal with this actually a lot more than you'd believe, or more than you would know. So those types of crimes are also ranked a little bit higher as well. Okay.
I have a question. So when we're thinking about stalking and taking legal action for that, I am just wondering, for everyone who comes in, do you recommend that they file a restraining order or do specific things that are like specific to the situation? Are there times when, I don't know, you recommend, oh, this looks like, it might make matters worse or, anger the person and put you in danger? Does it vary by circumstance?
Absolutely. Every case is a little bit different, and we are going to look at the as much as we can, because again, we're making snap decisions on these types of things from a law enforcement perspective. We're gathering this information, and in my head, I'm going through. I've got these 4 elements that I need to hit in order to get that particular charge, and I want to make sure that the person is safe, and that's the priority. If it comes down to it, and we need to provide the type of resources that makes the person and makes our victim safe, I'm all for doing that, because the charge can wait, unless it's something that we recognize that there's an imminent threat. Things then escalate. But there are times, and we've seen it quite often, where it's like, judging by what we're seeing on these text messages and these types of things, we would have a very frank discussion and say, look, do you think that this person is in a cooling off period, or are they on a freight train in a direction that we don't want to be a part of? In that case, we do basically what's called a threat assessment. And that's where we dig in a lot deeper with the individuals, the bad guy. And I keep using the bad guy. You guys know what I mean by bad guy. It could be anybody, but the offender. We'll do a lot of, as much as we can, we're going to dig into that person's background, so that we can make a good informed decision, because we do not want something that it ends up being where people can get hurt. So kind of a long way to answer your question of, yes, sometimes we punt the ball and come back to it when we've got a lot more that we can work with. I've spoken with survivors in the past also, and they'll ask, why aren't we moving faster on this? And it's a poker game in some ways, is that I want to make sure that before I go and I sit down and I talk to that offender, that I've got aces in my pocket, and I don't want to lose an opportunity to put someone behind bars for something based on just being too fast about it. It doesn't help anybody. Again, long winding road to that. So
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
okay. Some of the different ways that that we deal with or we receive reports. And I'm going to switch a little bit to our sexual assault cases. And just to tell you a little bit more about our officers and our detectives specifically, because I'm going to say around 9 or 10 years ago, there was a very large shift and a push in law enforcement to reassess the way that we respond and we address the investigations involving sexual assaults. And when we sat down and really started looking at things from a law enforcement perspective, we recognized that there was a lot of improvement that could be made. And the trauma-informed approach to investigations has been at the forefront of what it is what we at OUPD do. Presently, we have there's 3 detectives that are working for OUPD, and all of us have FETI training. So for those that aren't familiar with what FETI is, it's Forensic Experiential Trauma Interview, and that is it's a brand name, but it's pretty well known within these circles of what it is, and it's a way of doing an interview that kind of does an end around and opens up so many other doors that we didn't know were available. This is the way that I explain it to folks, is that so trauma witnesses and victims don't generally experience trauma as a uninvolved person would be. Okay. We see things a little differently because we are right in the middle of it. Okay. And the way that our brains work and the way that we receive information and we process it is very different than the general public that isn't dealing with this. And when we sit down and do an interview with a survivor, one of the first things that I explain to them is that we're going to do something that you might not understand where I'm going on this interview. And it might seem weird that I'm asking these questions because it's not the norm. It's not the, okay, what was he wearing? Where were you at this time? Where was this, where did this happen? What happened? And going, right down the list, which is what everyone has always seen on TV. Okay. And that's what I was trained to do, decades ago. It was the exact same thing, but hopefully we've gotten a little smarter with this, is that we recognize that the brain records things in a certain way. And if there's trauma, the trauma puts up roadblocks. The FETI interviews and the trauma-informed interviews are asking people questions that might seem like they're out of left field, because we're asking questions that deal with how did people feel, not what they remember, not what was said, but it talks about feeling. And when you ask about how did you feel or what did you sense, all the different senses. So what do you remember smelling? What do you remember hearing? When we ask some of those types of questions, it's almost like, and I know Casey can speak to this as well. She's been present on some of the interviews that we've had doing these. It's remarkable what people remember, because they're like, I don't remember anything. I don't remember anything at all. And they've got a block, and we ask them, okay, well, what do they smell like? And they're like, oh my gosh, he smelled like this, and there was this, and there was this, and I remember that he said this, and I remember this, the stubble on his face, and I remember this, and I remember looking at the wall, and I saw this time on the clock on the wall. And it's like, once you asked the right questions, it opens up so many different things. And when we, and I apologize, I'm getting a little off track, but I'll come back to it. Trust me. So when we ask people these questions in a way that kind of tricks the brain, it's almost like we let the floodgates open, and then it rolls and rolls and rolls, and we get the type of information that we never would have gotten through hours and hours of what people think of as an interrogation. It's just a different way of looking at things and a different way of approaching it. And this is, this type of training is not, it's relatively new in that there's not always funding to get everyone through the process. So we have our detectives that have all been trained on this, and we've, as much as possible, we share with our other officers some of our techniques. And, when we sit down, they might have had an interview with a survivor, within, a couple of hours of the event, and they'll have a basic interview, and they'll come back and they'll have, essentially a half a paragraph of information. And then after we let the survivor have a couple of sleep cycles, which then also breaks down with the chemicals in the brain, help to break down those roadblocks. The sleep cycles open up more information, and we get, reams of information where the other officer, who wasn't doing anything wrong per se, but he only got a paragraph, or she only got a paragraph, and they come to us and they're like, how did you get all this? They told me they didn't know anything. And we're like, look, it's about the way that you ask, and its technique, and it's the evolution of what we do. It's become something that we can use in every other type of crime. It doesn't have to be a sexual assault. It's anything that deals with how a witness views an event. It plays. So, all right, to change gears a little bit and to talk about how cases are reported to us. We have several different ways. One is the ECRC, which is the Equity, Civil Rights, Compliance, Title IX. People will say a survivor may make a report to their resident advisor or their RD. Those folks type up a little report. It gets sent on. We would be notified that something was reported, but we don't get all the details. In that case, I would send, all I would get would be a name. XYZ is the person's name. So I would send an email off to them saying, hey, this is who I am. We're advised that a report was been made. I don't know any details of it. If you'd like to, please feel free to reach out. And typically I'll get a response, yes or no, that type of thing. If the response is yes, well, then I would invite them in to come in and do an interview, like we talked about. Another way that we get reports, SANE kits. The hospital can determine venue, and venue is just the location of where the crime occurred and the jurisdiction of the law enforcement entity. So if it happens on campus in a residence hall, that's OUPD's jurisdiction. So the folks at O'Bleness know that, so they know if it happened there, then they call us and say, hey, we've got a SANE kit for you to pick up. In that case, then if it's not anonymous, then we'll also reach out to the survivor. If it is anonymous, those kits still get collected. Those kits still get shipped off to the state of Ohio for analysis. And that's where they can see if the offender is already in the database for, as a repeat offender. The next, another way that we get is the just a survivor walk-in or call-in, or if SAP calls also or brings somebody in. That's another way. Let me break there. Are there any questions that I can answer? Are we good on time? Okay. So the next part is I'm just going to kind of break down what our investigations are. Every one of them is different, and every one of them takes a lot longer than anyone could possibly imagine. And the amount of information that is gathered is akin to, okay, for an example, one regular case that involves, say a menacing by stalking case would be a file folder, nothing fancy in terms of size or anything like that. 70, 80, 100 pages worth of documentation. Okay. A sexual assault kit or sexual assault investigation could potentially be an expandable file or a banker's box or multiple banker's boxes. So those types of cases require us to be meticulous and very, very, absolutely as careful and thorough as possible. So when I sit down and I speak with survivors, I'll say, we're at the very, very start of what's going to be a long road. And what I try to convey is that I'm here with you. You are in charge, and you are running the ship. If we don't want to move forward, and let me back up also. We are mandatory reporters. So when someone comes in and says I was sexually assaulted, once they've passed the point of giving me the information about the crime and who the perpetrator is, I need to move forward with that. I will let them know before we typically get to that point to say, look, if you don't want to, because sometimes people will come in and sit down and say, I don't want anything to happen. I just want to tell somebody. Okay. I might not be the best person to tell because they might give me information that I have to act on, not only on their behalf, but on behalf of the residents of the state of Ohio, who we represent. Not only do we work for the university, but as people that get arrested at the fests and things like that are well too aware. We have arrest powers just like any other agency in the state of Ohio, and we bring the hammer down if typically more than other agencies do. When we deal with these types of cases, again, it's not like you see on TV. It's not a quick turnaround. These cases can last, on a rather basic or a vanilla case. These can be 8, 10, 12 months just to start. Larger cases, as Casey has worked with me on, they go much longer. So it's important to be thorough and to document everything, and we try to do that as well as we can. Communicating with the survivor is something that we try to work. We try to balance being annoying and what can be deemed as heavy-handed and pushy, but we don't want to be too standoffish. So there are times when, if I don't have, I'll let a survivor know, if I don't have any information, you're not going to hear from me. And it's not because I don't want to, or I don't think you need to know. It's just, I've got nothing to share with you. And just to call you at the end of every week and say, I got nothing, we're still moving forward. We found that that's not exactly what our survivors want to hear. So I'll keep them informed of milestones where, if I've got everything that I need on this case, or we've submitted a search warrant and gathered this information from this person or from this entity, I've analyzed it. It's given us either, yes, it's given us information that we wanted, or it's a dead end. I'll try to share that as much as possible. This whole time also, we've got the prosecutor's office in our boat as well. They are not necessarily doing the legwork. That's my job. But we work as a team in that they know what they need to have in order to move forward with a prosecution. And they make no bones about it. If you don't have this, that's not going to help us. So we need to get this before we can move forward. We try as much as possible, again, to keep everybody in the loop with multiple cases. There's a lot of cases going on. Things are a little slower, with the pandemic, just because there haven't been as many people in town from our end. But, that doesn't mean the city and the county and all the other agencies around in the county aren't flooding the prosecutor's office with cases as well. So we balance that as much as we can. Once we have any information or I get all the information that I need, then I present that to the prosecutor's office, and then they take the ball and run with it. They may follow up and say, hey, I need you to go and get something else, and we'll do that. But at that point, it's basically it's been passed off. The university, again, has a parallel process, the student conduct side of it, which is not something that I'm versed in. So I'm not going to, I don't know if that's something that Casey can talk about a little bit more than I could. But again, it's a parallel investigations. So that's pretty much it. Any questions?
I actually have one.
Sure.
I know when we were talking about the workshop in our meetings, something that a couple people were wondering about was the confidentiality involved in those interviews, and kind of what that's like.
Well, as part of a criminal investigation, your interview is going to be confidential in that it's not something that I'm sharing with the defense attorney or anything like that. It's all part of your case, and that stays locked in until it gets to court. Then those types of things are released. But again, if we've got a situation where somebody does not want to move forward with a case, there's times when we just end up sitting on that information, and it goes into a file somewhere, and it's not subject, because it's not part of a criminal case per se. It hasn't reached that level. That information basically just stays there.
Okay, awesome. Does anyone else have any more questions? If not, I'll hand it over to you, Casey. I also love your background. It looks very cozy.
Oh, it looks like Kim has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just had a quick question or area that I thought other people might be thinking of. Rick, could you talk a little bit just quickly about why we don't see people getting arrested very often for these types of crimes? Because I think that that's something that we get asked a lot in SAP, and something that comes up is that we hear about these situations being reported, but we don't actually see arrests happening. And I know that that isn't something that's only OUPD or APD's decision. So could you just talk about that a little bit to help people understand why that happens and what that process is in Athens?
I have opinions, but I'll keep them to the what the reality is that in our criminal justice system, there are time limits that apply for cases. In order for someone to be able to, so a defendant has rights, and they have the right to a speedy trial. And in certain situations, if we put handcuffs on someone and put them in a car and take them to the regional jail, the clock starts. And if we don't have the case in a position to prosecute within that certain window of whatever that window is, then that person can walk free without even having to, with nothing. So it's one of those things where through the years, I guess people have been burned, and the prosecution has missed out on the opportunity. So somebody might not be actually put in custody. And in most cases, they're going to be released on their own recognizance. So that 3-hour block that they were in jail is going to work to their benefit. So that's typically, and I think that's the best way that I can describe it. I don't like it at all. There are certain situations where, yes, we would definitely take someone into custody, but this is the game that we have to play. Unfortunately, that's the way it works. And it's not just Athens. It's not just our local jurisdiction. This is a very frustrating thing that happens all over the state.
Well, I guess I'll take over from here now if we're ready for my part. So I want to thank you all for having us here to talk about this. I also want to acknowledge that we don't have a representative from the Equity and Civil Rights Compliance Office, which is the Title IX office. So hopefully we may be able to have them do something like this at another point. So we won't be really addressing a whole lot of the university process today, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have them to do it in the future. I want to call attention to the things that you're seeing over in the chat, because it does have a link to the website for Equity and Civil Rights Compliance should you have any questions, as well as information about how to schedule an appointment with one of the advocates at SAP. So these processes are really confusing. You can see that through the conversations today that we've had. And there's so many moving parts and so many things that are involved. It can be really confusing and very overwhelming. It can be overwhelming for everybody, including the survivor, their family, co-survivors, and people that they're interfacing with as they go through this system. And that is one of the reasons why it's really great to have an advocate on board, because the advocate can help a survivor navigate these systems. And if there's something that the answer that the advocate doesn't know, they can devote the time to figuring that out and making those phone calls, so that that survivor doesn't have to do that, as well as go to class, work, deal with the traumatic reaction. That advocate can take on some of that work. So let's see, I want to share a little bit about the general information about the Survivor Advocacy Program. So there we all are. So in the Survivor Advocacy Program, there are 4 of us. We are all licensed social workers, and that gives us confidentiality and under Title IX on privilege in the courts. There you can see our emails that are there. You can also contact us via our website if you schedule an appointment through bookings. So we serve Ohio University students. We do not serve faculty, staff, or community members. There is a community program that serves that population, and that's called SAOP, and it's very close to SAP, but it is a different group. We do serve family and friends of survivors, which we might call co-survivors. Survivors can have past experiences or be dealing with something that's current. So it isn't like it had to have happened within this academic year. We serve a fair number of people who have a history of assault or trauma. So maybe somebody who had something happen in high school, or maybe even childhood assault. We also can work with students who are questioning if things that are going on in their lives are abusive, and have some discussions about that. So we really want to empower our victims. We do empowerment-based advocacy, and we want to help survivors find their voice and to take the power back that was taken from them. We accompany survivors to meetings and to different processes. We'll talk a little bit about that. We offer short-term crisis intervention, referrals to other services, and supportive counseling. We are currently working remotely, which means everything is on Teams, or we talk to people over the phone and different things, but most of everything that we're doing right now is on the Teams that you all are using for classes and whatnot as well. Hopefully that will be changing some in the future, and that we'll be able to do some more in-person or a hybrid model. But right now, everything is still pretty much on Teams. Here's our information again, and that is also in the chat. You'll be able to find that as well. We do have a 24-hour hotline that you can call. And one of the things that we do at ZAP is that we start by believing. And you can hear some more about this if you were to watch the documentary that Kim put up in the chat. So there is no standard way a survivor reacts to an assault. So there's no right way to respond to sexual violence or trauma. Each person will experience their own reactions, which could include physical, mental, emotional, spiritual changes and disruptions. All responses are valid and normal. Reactions to trauma in many ways represent the various ways that the human body attempts to protect us and heal us from the trauma that we've experienced. SAP recognizes that a survivor will tell their story when they are ready. We may have a student who comes in to talk to us who doesn't want to talk about the trauma narrative, doesn't want to talk about what happened, but maybe wants to talk about how they move through how they're feeling and how they can learn skills and coping mechanisms that can get them through the traumatic reaction. There have been people who I never knew the details or what happened as far as the assault. And that's okay, because people will tell us when they're ready. And it's their choice when they share. And we hear survivors, see survivors, and we believe survivors. We work to empower survivors. Since sexual assault is about power, it's the offenders need to have dominance and control. we work to give some of that power back to survivors. And one of the ways that we do that is we make sure that survivors are aware of their options and the choices that they have, because they do have choices. Some of those choices may be whether they want to report, whether they don't want to report, when they want to report, whether they want to get involved with other campus support systems, whether they want to go to the hospital. So those are just some different options that survivors might have. Advocates support survivors while they're figuring out what they want to do and beyond. So survivors have options, like I said, and their decision to tell someone is the survivor's decision and theirs alone. And one thing as a friend or a loved one of a survivor is that you want to make sure that they get to make decisions because they have had their choices taken away through an assault. So don't pick up the phone and call and make a report unless somebody is in imminent danger. You want to let them make that decision. As the survivor advocacy program can help survivors make an informed decision. So maybe help your friend or your loved one get to SAP or know about SAP services so that they can learn more about what options that they have. And it's important to know that due to the nature of our licensure, SAP advocates are confidential resources. So we do not have to report to the university or to law enforcement. And a survivor can choose to report to law enforcement, to OUPD, if it happened on campus, or APD, if it happened off of campus, or to the university with Title IX office. They can report to both or neither. They can make a choice that maybe they just want to report to Title IX and they don't want to go through a law enforcement process. That's fine too. So survivors also have the right to take their time. So a survivor can take their time while considering options. Support people help by sharing options and allowing the survivor to make the choices. So once again, being knowledgeable about what's available. And if you don't have knowledge, then maybe you can find out. You can call the Survivor Advocacy Program or contact us. Maybe you have a friend who has had an assault and they don't want to talk to SAP yet, but you want to know some information to share with them. Maybe you want to know more about our services. You can always call and we can provide that information so that you can let your friend know, yeah, you can make an appointment with SAP. They're confidential, and let them know about the kinds of things we do. So unless one is a mandated reporter, one should always allow the survivor to decide about reporting. And so the only absolutely time-sensitive reporting piece is the forensic exam. So there's 96 hours post-assault to gather forensic evidence in a SANE exam. So let's say that a student has had an assault and they don't know if they want to follow through with a police report. I think that Rick mentioned that you can have a not named kit or an anonymous kit. And that is held, and that way, if a survivor goes in within that 96-hour period and isn't sure whether they want to report, they can still gather that forensic evidence, and it's still there should they decide in the future that they want to move forward. Advocates can go to the SANE exam with the survivor. Now, right now, we're doing that remotely, but in normal times, we can meet the survivor at the hospital and be present with them physically as they're doing the exam. We can sit in the lobby and wait for them, or we can be present in the exam room with them. That's another choice and decision that the survivor has. So how do we work with the law enforcement reporting process? So we can help the survivor know their options before reporting. We can talk a little bit about what that looks like. We can be contacted through law enforcement. So if a survivor is already meeting with the police, or if the police have set up an appointment to do an interview, they may contact us on behalf of the survivor if the survivor requests that. However, a survivor may also come to us first, and we can contact the police and say, hey, can we make an appointment to have a meeting or an interview with somebody? So it can be either way. So we can go to the interviews with police, with law enforcement. During the pandemic, we've also been doing this remotely, and it's worked out pretty well. So what happens with that is that the survivor would take their computer or whatever they wanted to use. It might be their phone, and they can get on Teams, and we can be present with them as they're speaking to the police in the interview room, from a remote location. When it's not the pandemic, we get to go in person with somebody. It seems to have worked out pretty well, just differently, being remote. And the police have been very welcoming to having us be present that way. We can be a liaison between the survivor and law enforcement. What I mean by that is sometimes there may be a question that a survivor has, or or law enforcement might have, and that we may be able to help figure that out. We may be able to get a hold of a survivor, maybe if the law enforcement can't, or vice versa. We can also be a point of contact for a survivor's parents with written permission. And I think I talk about this a little bit further on as well. And what that might look like is, I know myself as a parent, if something were to happen to my son and he had to make a police report, I would want to know what was happening constantly. As a parent, I'd be calling, well, have you talked to the prosecutor? Have you talked to the police? Where are the police? And that can be very stressful to a survivor who may not know those answers that the parent wants to know. So a number of survivors have signed release of information so that the parent can contact us. So I can tell the parents if I need to, oh, they're not there yet, it's still in waiting. And that kind of provides a cushion for the survivor who won't have to repeat that information over and over again. And that also provides a spot for the parents to talk about their concerns and their fears regarding the process. So how do we support a survivor through the court process? So we can be a liaison with the prosecutors, much like I talked about with law enforcement. So a survivor should not be wondering when their case is going to move forward, what the timeline looks like, where the prosecution is in the process. And a survivor or an advocate can find out that information for a survivor. We can be the one making phone calls and emails on their behalf and free up the survivor to be a student and to be working on other things. SAP can be present for prosecution interviews and remotely if possible, much like we can be with the police. Advocates can support parents who have many questions with written permission. And an advocate can help a survivor prepare for court. So what that might look like is we might help somebody work through some grounding practices that they could do either before court or even as if they're getting ready to go on the stand. We have helped people learn how to use their voice for like voice projection. It's very, or it can be very overwhelming to be sitting on the stand and people can close themselves off and it becomes very difficult for people to hear them. So we've worked with people on how to project and how to present themselves when they're in court. We may help somebody figure out what they want to hold in their hands, whether it be like a worry stone or like some of the support stones that are ASAP made, things like that. Someone might want to have something in their hands, so we can help them with things like that. We accompany survivors to court proceedings, and we also can attend some of the court proceedings that maybe a survivor doesn't want to go to, which aren't mandatory, such as like certain pre-hearings and things. And then we can report what we found out back to the survivor if they didn't want to be present at those hearings. So one thing that is really important for people to know is when does healing begin? I've had survivors say, I'm going to feel better when this person is convicted, or I'll feel better when they are found responsible. And it doesn't always work out that way. So it's very important to realize that healing begins when a survivor takes their power back, when they have the opportunity to make a decision for themselves whether or not to report. The assault was not their decision. They didn't have that power. Somebody took it from them. So every survivor's healing journey is unique to that survivor. The way they react to, address, and define their experience is completely up to them. Just as there's no single path for healing, there is no timeline for healing either. It is not linear. It may include phases and stages that stretch out over time. Our society defines an arbitrary timeline for how long anyone is allowed to grieve trauma or a loss, and there's often pressure to move on or get over it. And survivors may not feel as if they can ask for what they need. And there isn't any getting over something like this. You have to learn how to get through it. And you learn that through learning how to take care of yourself and how to do self-care and learning coping mechanisms. A survivor may experience emotional disruptions on and off, maybe for years. And they may feel great for a long time and not have any resurgence of their traumatic reaction, but something might happen. They might smell something, like Rick was saying earlier. They might smell something that reminds them, and all these memories might come flooding back. These responses might be provoked by an anniversary, by reading a news story, as well as being caused by instability that occurs in major life changes like graduation, transition times, getting married, the pandemic. So healing is a process and it's not a destination. Trauma is something that one must learn to walk through instead of just getting over it. By learning the skills to get through, one learns how to navigate that system or those reactions when they happen again. The process of healing is ongoing, and it's an ongoing practice that requires a survivor to be intentional, consistent, and to have endurance. It requires a willingness to be on the part of the survivor to begin again and begin again and begin again. Survivors benefit when the support system holds space for them in which to process their loss without the expectations or pressure, making room to integrate the experience on a variety of levels. Does anybody have any questions? Well, if you think of any questions, you know where to find us, and you just reach out and let us know. And we would be happy to answer in any way we can. And we can also look for answers if we don't know him.
All right. If there are no questions, thank you so much, Casey. And I think this is the end of the workshop. So thank you for speaking and taking the time to be here. We really, really appreciate that and all of the work you do. It was really wonderful to learn more about the reporting process and all of the resources available. And before everyone leaves, I do have a survey that you can fill out. It's really quick. It'll take just a minute. It's just about the workshop that helps us know how it went. And I think that's all I have.
Thank you, and thanks for making this happen.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. And thanks for everyone for coming and learning new important things. Bye.
All right. See ya.
Yeah, I was not sure if like you wanted to say anything, but if not, really great job. You did amazing. And this, like, I literally learned so much just myself, especially like from Elizabeth. So yeah, great job.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes me nervous to moderate these.